Hey, it's Akshat. Each week, you lend me your ears, and now I'd like to hear from you. Do you have a burning question about climate, green tech, or the future of the planet? Please send your questions to us in writing or as a voice memo to zeropod@bloomberg.net, and we'll make an episode answering them. Please do include your name and where you're based. Thank you. Welcome to Zero. I am Akshat Rathi. This week, can warfare go green? It's been a tense few months. Just a couple of weeks ago, it felt like the world was on the brink of another world war when the US bombed Iranian nuclear sites. And while World War III may have been averted for now, there are more than 100 armed conflicts still going. These wars don't just kill people, but they're also responsible for a huge amount of carbon emissions. By some estimates, the US military is the world's largest consumer of oil. As one US general said in 2011, energy is the lifeblood of our war-fighting capabilities. Western economies are now gearing up for a big expansion of military spending. The 32 member countries that form NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, have agreed to increase defense spending to a staggering 5% of their GDP by 2035. That will be trillions of dollars more going to an enormously carbon-intensive industry. But few people want to talk about carbon emissions and wars. It's one reason why defense departments have escaped the scrutiny faced by businesses or even other parts of government. If all that money goes to buying gasoline-hungry equipment that keeps militaries around the world hooked to fossil fuels, it will make fighting climate change even harder. And the trouble is, climate change is a threat multiplier. The hotter the planet, the higher the risks of conflicts, and the deadlier those wars. Somehow, this circle needs to be squared. While countries feel they must spend more on militaries, doing so in a way that will increase emissions is also not in the interest of national security.
I always get criticised by people who call me woke for thinking climate and military, that I'm thinking about electric tanks. I'm not. But there is an absolute truth in the view that electric drives on a vehicle makes that vehicle better.
My guest today is Richard Nugee, who was Lieutenant General in the British Army, equivalent to a 3-star general. He served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and in 2021, before he retired from the military, he published a report on what the UK's military must do in the face of climate change. The report considered both how the British military is affected by climate change and what it must do to cut its emissions. I wanted to find out from Richard whether militaries are taking the risks of climate change seriously, can warfare go green, and does the increase in NATO spending come at the expense of global climate goals? Welcome to the show, Richard.
Thank you.
So when you were on tour in Afghanistan or in Iraq, did you ever think about how climate impacts might affect the work you were doing on the ground?
So I suppose the really interesting moment for me was in Iraq in 2003. I sort of commanded, loose word, everything south of Basra, about the size of Wales, with 1,000 soldiers in my battle group. And we were there, therefore, in the summer of 2003, after the war had finished. And it got up to about 50 degrees. And what was very evident, most of the time the heat was very, very dry heat. So the wind came from the north and so down through the desert. And so it was dried out by the time it got to us in the south of Iraq. But for 2 weeks of the year, there was a thing which the Iraqis, and I can't remember the word in their language, but it translated as the cooker, where the wind backed and came up the Gulf. And there you therefore had 100% humidity and 50 degrees of heat.
Wow.
Well, that's actually physically impossible for humans to live in. And so we were really, really struggling to be able to operate in an environment where it was so hot that you took a shower, you dried off, you were immediately soaked again. You woke up soaked, you moved 2 meters, you were soaked because you were sweating so much. I had one soldier who drank 16 liters of water and was still dehydrated. We had, out of the 1,000-odd soldiers over time, we used 250 about drips to keep people with enough moisture in their bodies, and we had to send 5 people home for heat stroke. Now, wars in the sort of Middle Ages, always the biggest killer was not the war itself, but was disease and was dysentery and things like that. I lost no soldiers on that tour. Very sadly, one died from a heart attack, but I lost no soldiers through enemy action. But I lost 5 back to the UK because of heat, and I put sort of in hospitals, if so to speak, for a short time, 250. So the heat had a very, and there was no air conditioning. We were living in what was there, buildings. We got tents, but they weren't air conditioned. That all came much later, and for the troops much later. So there's a piece there about soldiers always find it difficult to operate in intense heat. That is really intense heat. And so that came to me that actually, as the world is getting warmer, and I don't think anybody can deny the world's getting warmer, it is going to make it more difficult for soldiers to operate. And then there's all sorts of equipment issues as well.
We should come to talking about now, how does national security, defense, the military think about climate change in both operating conditions and in trying to tackle the problem, because the military does contribute to the problem in big ways. But before we go there, the report that you ended up writing in 2021 as a result of starting to think about climate change and the impact on military and what it could do, you had in your introduction these words, and I'm going to read them because they are in a way prophetic and we are living through it now. You said, the threats of our modern world, made worse by rising seas, extreme weather, and creeping desertification, will almost certainly lead to more conflict. And more conflict in itself will damage the planet. Those involved in conflict will not be able to focus on the climate and instead will be creating more emissions whilst in conflict. We are seeing many more conflicts now relative to 2021 when you wrote the report. The war between Russia and Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza, America's attack on Iran. We can't say climate change caused them. A lot of the conflicts that have happened around the world may have climate as a contributing factor in some places. Syria is probably the best studied. But it is true right now, with all that's happening, the military's focus is very much on fighting and not on climate. So at such a time, given the work you've done, how do you get the leadership to think about climate change at all?
It's a very good question, because it is that perennial question of the urgent over the important. And the urgent, as we used to say in the military, the crocodile closest to the canoe, is going to be the threat of war in Europe, the threat of war with Russia. Europe is part of NATO, but you've also got wars all around, you've got more wars around the world. And that, for a military person, you have to focus on the enemy in front of you. And the enemy in front of you is a physical presence, if you like. It's a Russian army or Russian Air Force or Russian Navy or whatever. So how do you say, well, hang on a minute, there's something which is contributing to, might be causing those wars in the first place? And the answer comes from, I think, 2 things. One is, for militaries as much as for politicians, understanding the causes of war is an important step to understanding how to create a lasting peace. No war ends, or very, very few wars end without some sort of political settlement. So understanding the causes of those wars is really, really important. And if climate change is part of that, then you need to understand that. As a soldier, you need to understand those causes. It won't answer the question immediately in front of you, but you do begin to understand the causes. That's the first piece. And the second piece is about how can militaries bluntly take advantage of the technologies that are trying to solve the climate change issues to make themselves a better, more effective military. So there's a win-win here. One is understanding the causes of war, and the other is embracing the technologies to try and make your prosecution of that war more effective by looking at some of the new technologies that are coming on side.
And it's also true that given the importance of national security, defense departments around the world tend to be the better funded departments, tend to be the places where governments have slightly looser purses because it is seen as a threat that needs to be managed and it is seen as an urgent threat. So for a long time, there has been discussion that because the defense departments have more money and they are also places where frontier technologies have tended to be used or deployed or developed as a result, that those would be the places where we could be pioneering a lot of green technologies, because they could be good for the military and they will have civilian uses too. What are success stories that you think exist today in that basket, and how could we build more of them?
So I'll give one example, and how much of a success story is it? You could debate, but sustainable aviation fuel. If you look at when I wrote the report in 2021, 77% of the Royal Air Force's emissions were from fuel. And that's fairly logical. Fast jets use an awful lot of fuel. Interestingly, 55% of the Navy's emissions were fuel. For the Army, it's down below 10%. Is their equipment, actually. Most of it is on their land mass. So if you're trying to tackle the problem of fuel and emissions, then you need to find an alternative, and the alternative does exist. It's called sustainable aviation fuel. There's lots of different types of sustainable aviation fuel, but there's an absolute key, if you like, requirement of the Air Force if they're going to get their emissions down, to go down that route. So what did the Air Force do? And of course, they're not unique in this, but what they did is they first of all got the whole of NATO, the Royal Air Force got the whole of NATO to agree a protocol which said that all NATO equipments, should be capable of taking 50% sustainable aviation fuel. So it's now expanded beyond just a single military, the Royal Air Force in our case, to militaries across NATO should have the capability. It doesn't mean to say they have to use it, but they should have the capability to do so, because there are different protocols of different fuels. With the intent, and I don't know whether that intent will be met or not because it's in the future, the intent of being able to, a protocol to say you'd be able to take 100% sustainable aviation fuel by about 2040. That sends a message to the market. That's the first thing which is quite important. It's the message to the market. The second thing is that the Royal Air Force has been experimenting with sustainable aviation fuel. So we have flown our first fast jet with SAF. We've flown our first passenger aircraft, but they're called Voyagers, which are also refueling tankers, which are also used for cargo, using SAF, 100% SAF. So that shows that not only is there intent, theoretical intent, there's practical application, and we have shown that we can do it. Then you look at, why would anybody pay attention to us? And there's two very, very good reasons. One is, if the Air Force, so the Ministry of Defence, says it wants to buy some, you can guarantee, as much as anything can be guaranteed, that they will pay once they've got the fuel. They're not going to go bust. So there's a guarantee of income for somebody creating SAF. The second piece is it shows that there is a government backing to sustainable aviation fuel. So all those tiny companies that are creating SAF, that are speculating whether the civil aviation industry or not will buy it, as it is more expensive at the moment. In due course, it'll be as cheap, I believe, but that will take time and it'll take certain circumstances. But the fact that the government is prepared to invest and say, yes, we want it, is something that sends a very significant message to the market, but more importantly, sends a message to those producers who are relatively small. They're all startups, so to speak. They might have scaled to a certain extent. It gives them confidence to go with it.
It's also happening in the US, where the Defense Department is putting out requests for more advanced battery technologies, because those technologies are being used in warfare today. We've seen how Ukraine was able to use drones to be able to destroy a lot of very key and very expensive infrastructure in Russia. And so people who I've talked to who've worked in climate tech, who do battery research, are finding Defense Department procurement requests coming in, or development requests coming in for advanced batteries. You do get these impacts in also places where maybe climate is not the focus, but the technology itself might be developed and have climate uses.
Absolutely. And I think there's a really important piece here about dual-use technology. And it's something that I would say again and again and again, because people don't understand it. Most people, when they think defense, they think weapons. And they will say that my technology for green transition or green technology has no purpose in weapons. And they're right. But it completely misunderstands how ministries of defense work. And in the army, as an example, 30% of the actual army, of the British army, 30% is at the tip of the spear. The other 70% is the shaft of the spear supporting that tip. And of course, the shaft of the spear, if I can use that analogy, is far more than weapons. In fact, it's not weapons. It's everything else. It's medical. There's logistics. There's batteries. There's vehicles. There's maintenance. There's so much else. And all of that can translate relatively simply into the civilian market. And so this dual-use technology, which many people don't see the value of my technology, it's a green technology, why would the Ministry of Defence be interested? The answer is they're thinking too narrowly about what defence is about. I'll give you just one example. Very simple example, which is we traditionally have had diesel-driven vehicles in the army, Land Rovers, tanks. Now, I'm absolutely not suggesting, and I always get criticised by people who call me woke for thinking climate and military, that I'm thinking about electric tanks. I'm not. But there is an absolute truth in the view that electric drives on a vehicle makes that vehicle better. It's better for all sorts of reasons. It's better for the obvious reasons that you're silent. You don't have the same transmission in terms of heat or in terms of exhausts. None of that can be seen by the enemy because you're silent and you're stable in terms of heat. But it's also easier to drive. They're better vehicles because the battery weight is all at the lowest level of the vehicle, and therefore you've got a much better weight distribution on the vehicle, which makes them better off-road. And on top of that, you don't have, for the soldiers in that vehicle, the vibration and the noise, which actually dulls their senses over time. So it's a much, much better vehicle. Now, I'm not advocating 100% electric because that becomes too susceptible to too many areas of range anxiety, is how the civilians call it. But there's all sorts of things on the battlefield which would make that difficult. But hybrid vehicles, which are basically electric vehicles with a little diesel engine to recharge the battery, that is a really successful opportunity for people in the military to use dual-use technology coming out of the EV world to come into the military. And then on top of that, you can use the batteries for recharging your radios, recharging all those electronic devices that each individual soldier has. There is masses of opportunity for technology that doesn't seem to have a value in the military actually being presented to the military and saying, look, we can do this. Can you find a use for it? And the military 9 times out of 10 will say, actually, do you know what? We can find a use for that.
In a way, it's nice that people don't think about their technologies having weapons use, because most of the time we are living in peaceful times and we don't have to think about weapons. But it is worth remembering that in the past, it is militaries that have decided the kind of technology that the world runs on. The famous example of Churchill deciding to move the Navy from burning coal to burning oil is what ushered in the era of oil in the 20th century. Now, you're talking about electrification and about the use of hybrids. There are limits, especially if we talk about military uses, on how much electrification could do. So a fast jet is not going to be running on batteries, neither is a tank. But how much further can electrification go into the military space, and where are those opportunities today?
You're right. And as I say, I'm not arguing for a 100% electric tank. But there's a number of other areas where it can be used. If we have overseas bases, whether they're temporary bases, well, let's go for temporary bases, operational bases. One of the issues in Iraq and Afghanistan was the delivery of oil to patrol bases and forward bases so that we could run our vehicles out of them, whether it was helicopters that were landing and had to be refueled, and that didn't happen often at the forward bases, but whether it was the vehicles that the soldiers used in order to be able to patrol. You need fuel to get there. The American Army armed forces lost somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 soldiers killed just getting fuel through. The British lost their most senior officer killed in Afghanistan getting the fuel through. So if you can design a power supply that doesn't rely on diesel in these operational bases so much, you don't need to get so much fuel through, and therefore you're going to lose fewer lives, it's going to cost less, and also you can use the equipment that is protecting those fuel convoys out somewhere else. So there's a very good argument. And Rolls-Royce, and it's supported by the government, Rolls-Royce is looking at micro-nuclear, where you can put a nuclear power station effectively in a 40-foot container. If you put that 40-foot container into one of our operational bases, you can bury it, you can make sure it's secure, then actually you have almost unlimited fuel, and therefore you do not need diesel to go down the road to be able to charge your generators or to charge your vehicles. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is our permanent bases. You can look at building resilience through having solar panels. We're looking at hydro. We're looking at wind on our bases. We have a lot of bases around the world, permanent bases, either abroad or in this country, in the UK, where actually we need to produce two things. One, we need to produce electricity for the base. And if you can do that cheaper through green energy, then why wouldn't you? But more importantly, it provides that resilience. I would imagine the Spanish and Portuguese armed forces would be a little bit embarrassed that they might not have been able to get out of their camp in that blackout. And yet the one time you need the armed forces is when you have something like a blackout or where you have some sort of trauma that is causing a problem to the country. If you have your own electricity supply because you've gone down the green energy route and the green transition route, you have the ability to get out of the barracks and you have the ability to be able to operate even in the environment where there is a blackout on the national grid. That's really important. If the military are genuinely the force of last resort, then they need to be able to operate under any conditions. And therefore, if you create your own electricity, then you are more secure and you're more resilient.
We'll be back with more of my conversation with Richard Nugee after this break. And hey, if you're finding this episode insightful, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Your feedback really matters and helps new listeners discover the show. Thank you. With all these conflicts, defense departments are increasing spending, especially in NATO, which just recently met, and the members agreed, except Spain, to increase their spending to 5% of the country's gross domestic product by 2035. Now, not all of that needs to go into weapons, but a lot of it will go into weapons. Is there a risk that a lot of the green spending, which these same governments whose budgets are tight, who do not have the capacity to borrow too much, are going to redirect that green spending into defense instead?
So first of all, I would say that the 3.5% is going to defence as a whole rather than just to weapons. And one of the interesting angles that the Defence Review published last month, was to absolutely not say what size the armed forces should be, because what it said is just we need to grow the armed forces. So it's not just weapons, it's people, it's all the support that I was talking about earlier. So first of all, 3.5% is not just weapons. And the 1.5% can be used for, quote, national security and resilience. So there's huge scope, actually, for national security and resilience to be part of the green solutions that the country is trying to do as well. But to the basis of your question, are the two incompatible with each other? Is one stealing from the other? I think the answer is absolutely not. A more resilient nation, a nation that is more self-sufficient in energy particularly, is an advantage to our defence. I'll take a very, very simple historical example, and of course it doesn't translate immediately and totally. But in the Second World War, fuel, oil, was really limited because we had to bring all the oil to this country through the Atlantic, where things were being sunk by submarines, U-boats, and through other vehicles. Everything had to come by sea. So what did the country do? It rationed fuel for the average citizen, so that the vast majority of the fuel could go to the military. And in fact, the only people really who were given a ration were transport companies, so that people could use public transport, and farmers, because we had to create food. Translate that into the 21st century. Our militaries are still using oil, whether it's diesel or whatever, for the ability to fight. So we're still going to need to import huge amounts of fuel in much more contested waters in a war where submarines are more effective, and it's much more, it's much more difficult to defend tankers and so on, partly because of their size. So the country itself cannot rely to the same level. We can't ration in the same way that we did in the Second World War, because everything's much more electrified. Everything's, much more reliant on oil than it used to be, much more reliant. So what is the alternative? The alternative, and interesting, I was reading an article just this morning, the alternative is to use less oil. And that's not necessarily for a green reason, but that, of course, is an advantage to the whole climate issue. But it's so that if oil is restricted in war, you have already built the alternatives. To my mind, it is entirely logical to say that the defence and the war effort, if you had to go down that route, is reinforced by having green energy and going further with the green energy transition, because actually what you're doing is providing resilience to a country that becomes less dependent on oil and more dependent on self-created energy, which means that the limited oil that might come across the seas to us can be used for the military to make sure that you don't limit the military, because the military are going to need every drop of oil in order to be able to fight effectively. And that's what you want your militaries to do. So I see the two as completely compatible and completely in unison. And it would be a tragic mistake if through politics and through politicization, the green energy transition was seen at odds to our security. I would argue exactly the opposite.
What did you recommend the Defense Department do when it thinks about climate change, both as an impact on how it's going to have to protect the UK, but also as its role in doing some of this green procurement, in pushing technologies forward, in reducing emissions? Where is the UK now? How many of those steps has it followed? And what more can it do?
I think most people in the climate world who I speak to would say nobody is doing anything fast enough and they're not doing enough. The Ministry of Defence would fall into that as well, of course, because they have to be careful that everything they do increases our capability rather than reduces it. And I famously said, you can have the greenest Navy, the greenest Air Force and the greenest Army in the world, but if you come second in a war, you come second in a war, and that's not what we're paid to do. So we need to be quite careful. And what did I suggest? In the first 5 years, take advantage of the existing technologies, particularly in our bases. There's perfectly good solar panels. They're cheap. Why wouldn't we use those now to create the electricity that we need? And we spend an enormous amount of money, or the MOD, sorry, I keep on saying we, but the Ministry of Defence spends an enormous amount of money on energy every year. If they can reduce that by creating their own, then that surely is a good thing. The second thing I suggested, and this is so important, the MOD needs to put the concept of climate change and adapting to climate change into its processes. And that sounds really dull, but actually, if you put it into your processes, if you have sort of what I call no return valves, you have to jump that fence. You have to ask the question about the world that we're going to be living in 2050, assuming a 2 degree or more in 2050. And interestingly, the Committee on Climate Change, when I was talking to them, when I was writing the report, were asking the Ministry of Defence to look at two scenarios, a 2 degree increase and a 4 degree increase. The idea that we'd stick to 1.5 was already in the Committee on Climate Change at that time. They're thinking it was already, we'd go beyond that. And I think they're realistic in that case. Looking at how will our equipments that, broadly speaking, we plan, the Ministry of Defence plans on a 40-year life cycle. If you work on that basis, equipment bought in 2020 will be still around in 2060. What is the environment it's going to be operating under? You have to build that into process, because nobody's going to come to a decision based on a theoretical unless it's in the process. What has the MOD done? They have built that into the process already. They have built the adaptation of, we might be looking at 50 to 55 degrees as a norm in various parts of the world rather than completely exceptional. They've built into the process the idea that surface sea temperature could be much higher than it is today, and therefore is going to be less effective in cooling the engines of our warships. The second thing, or the third thing, is actually changing the culture. And I reckoned it would take 5 years to change the culture. Has that culture changed? It is changing. It is changing where people are very aware of what climate change is doing, what's a sort of sustainability. And sustainability is really simple. Is if you have fragile supply chains for rare earths because they're all processed in China, for example. If you have fragile supply chains, what do you do? Well, actually, you need to recycle what you've got. The military have been exceptionally good at recycling certain things. So the brass cartridge cases out of our artillery and out of our infantry when we're in training, that all is recycled. We've done that for years and years and years. So this is nothing new, but actually it's new things that we need to think about recycling that would be much better for the Ministry of Defence and would be cheaper. So there's various things that the Ministry of Defence is already doing and is doubling down on. There's various things that they have put into process, which is beginning to work. But the next 10 years and the 15 years beyond that, of course, was much looser in the strategy and in the strategic thinking. Because, I remember saying to somebody, I was writing this in 2020, I was saying, how many of the strategies are we following that were written in 1990? Well, of course, the world's changed out of all proportion between 1990 and 2020. So it's going to change dramatically. So you can't prescript. You can't prescribe, much as people would love us to do so, but you can't do that. So you have to come up with just options and ideas, and that's what I did.
It is interesting to realize how supply chains can be such a bottleneck for all sorts of things. The fact that the US and China's trade war was predicated on being resolved if China provided enough magnets and the metals to make those magnets to the US. It tells you that even if the amount of those materials is small, the value of those materials in commercial terms is small, their strategic importance is so much that the two largest economies have made peace for now based on access to those minerals. But if you were to think now, having done this report 5 years ago, what have you changed your mind about? What is it that you recommended that you would change or you would go further?
It's always difficult to ask somebody who's written a report to then say that they would change it. I think I tried to put it into basic principles and basic tenets rather than specific detail. I would argue that actually what I missed was the newer technologies coming on board. I said for 5 years work with existing technologies, for the 10 years after that work with technologies, or at least begin to understand what new technologies are about. Those new technologies are coming on stream so fast. But I think there is a very, very different, there is war already in Europe, which wasn't there when I wrote the report. But I think this point that you make about supply chains and about China, and I did not know at the time that 80% of lithium, 75% of cobalt or there or thereabouts is processed in China. It doesn't come from China, but it's all taken to China to be processed. That provides a bottleneck. I would argue that no country should rely on one other country that does 80% of the processing of anything, because you become completely dependent on that country. The fact that it's China doesn't help the case, but if it was a friendly country, I would not advise it either. And so I think understanding those supply chains, I would put far more emphasis into the recycling and the sustainability and trying to find alternatives to those supply chains than I did in the report, because I think that we have become a much more polarized world since I wrote that report. And that means that we're much more vulnerable to changes in geostrategic politics and the geopolitics of the power games that are happening between Russia, China, and America particularly. We're much more vulnerable to that. And I think, of course, politicians are seeing that now.
What has changed since you wrote the report is how much more extreme weather impacts the world is seeing, and how many more times militaries around the world are being deployed to try and help countries deal with these impacts. What should militaries be thinking about if they are tapped into doing this kind of work more and more as the planet keeps getting hotter?
My first point would be I completely agree with you. If you look at what happened in Pakistan, in the huge floods in Pakistan, and they have a very large military, but about a third of the military was deployed in order to try and solve some of the problems of floods. The military is very large because they see a huge threat from India, and therefore, it is there for a purpose, which is to defend the country against India. Now, that's a perceived threat. To put a third of that into dealing with floods is a very significant move for any country. So absolutely, militaries are being used more and more often. What does that bring? First of all, there have been calls, and there were calls even when I was writing the report, to create an alternative force to be able to deal with humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And I would argue that in war, if you're at war, yes, that's probably necessary. But all sorts of things change if you're actually at war. In peace, it's probably not necessary, because it is very good training for the military to be able to do this, and it is a purpose for the military. Secondary purpose, I get, but it's a purpose for the military. What should the militaries be doing? They should be honing their skills far more effectively. They should make sure that they have the right equipment, far more of the right equipment to be able to deal with these humanitarian assistance and disasters. And also, we should be collaborating. This is a really good... Militaries on the whole collaborate on a even keel. Now, when they're at war, of course they don't, but militaries all think alike, broadly speaking. They tend to get on well with each other, broadly speaking. It is the politicians who set them against each other. I would always argue that I could walk into the Australian Ministry of Defence and it would be more familiar to me when I was serving than walking into the UK Home Office. Because our way of thinking was so similar. All our problems were the same. Militaries, broadly speaking, have the same problems. Of course, the solutions are very, very different. So it is an opportunity for militaries to collaborate. Militaries that wouldn't naturally collaborate because they have nothing, there's no politics there, could collaborate and learn and build together a humanitarian assistance and disaster relief concept and equipment and so on as a way of getting closer together. That, by the way, if militaries are reluctant to fight each other, it causes politicians to pause. Doesn't cause them to stop, but it causes them to pause.
Well, in a world where there's more fractures happening and geopolitics is getting more divided, any moment to find places to collaborate is a good place to end the conversation. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much indeed.
And thank you for listening to Zero. Now for the sound of the week. That's the sound of a robot doing low-grade parkour. Militaries around the world are looking to deploy these kinds of robots in warfare. You might even have spotted robot dogs at the US military parade held just a few weeks ago. If you like this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Share this episode with a friend or with someone in the military. This episode was produced by Oscar Boyd and Jessica Beck. Our theme music is composed by Wonderly. Special thanks to Laura Milan, Somar Sadi, Moses Andam, and Siobhan Wagner. I am Akshat Rathi, back soon.